A Harvard graduate with a PhD in linguistics, Deborah spent much of her life learning languages and traveling around the world. But nothing prepared her for the surprises of learning Mandarin or the intensity of living in Shanghai and Beijing. Deb realized over time that her struggles and triumphs in studying the language of her adopted home provided small clues to deciphering the behavior and habits of its people and its culture's mysteries. As her skill with Mandarin increased, bits of the language became windows into understanding the romance, humor, protocol, relationships, and humanity of modern-day China. Please join me in welcoming Deborah Fallows.
Thank you, Candace. Thank you, Google. This has to be the highlight of any author's book tour, to end up at Google. So thanks so much for having me. It's a real pleasure. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay, great. I want to talk about three things today. First is how Jim and I got to China in the first place. The second is how I tried to study the language. And the third is how the process of studying the language taught me about China and its people and its culture. It's been the pattern that Jim and I have had over 39 years of being married, that we've lived about half the time in Washington, D.C., and half the time out on the road in various countries, Japan, Malaysia, Africa, England, Texas, another foreign country. We were in Berkeley for a year, Seattle for a few years at another unnamed company. Jim writes for the Atlantic Monthly magazine, where he's always done reporting. When we went to China, I worked for the Pew Internet Project. We did surveys and polling of US internet users, and I must say that I always knew that you knew all the secrets, but would never share them with us, and we just had to ask the people what they thought about what they were doing rather than really know what they were doing. So now I feel like I'm kind of at the heart of it all, being here. So before we went to China, we did everything we could to try to prepare ourselves for the experience. You know, we talked to everyone we knew who had been there. We read books. We went to see Mission Impossible 3, which was the current film about China at the time. And I also I spent about a year going to night school at Georgetown University, to their night and continuing ed program. Studied from a book called Chinese 300, which was written in 1985. And a very funny old text. And eventually it ended up to be that we knew we had a very inadequate introduction to China, but we just took the leap of faith, got on the plane, and headed for Shanghai. So what I'd like to do before I actually talk about this book is to set you up with a little bit of what our life actually looked like in China, where we lived in Shanghai and Beijing. We were there for 3 years, half the time we started out for a year and a half in Shanghai and then moved to Beijing for a year and a half, just to see and we traveled around extensively around the country. So I just want to give you a picture of what it looked like from our point of view. And also, especially to watch out for the contrasts, because I noticed when we came back from China, people were always saying, well, what was it like? What was China like? And we finally just gave up with trying to generalize some answer and said, China is everything. It's contradictions simultaneously. Anything you say about China is true, and so watch for the contradictions here. So this was the view from where we lived in our apartment in Shanghai. A very overwhelming introduction. That was the first day in Shanghai. This was the second day with the same view in Shanghai. You can probably barely make out the outline of what we called the Bat Building, the one with the 2 horns sticking up. As soon as we exited our apartment, we were on the streets in Shanghai. These were our neighborhoods. These were our neighbors. This guy is texting, by the way, you can see. I think there are, actually it's really hard to collect reliable data and statistics in China, so I can't even begin to say the number of people who have mobile phones and internet access via their phones, because they often there are hundreds of millions of phones, but then everybody shares phones, so there are really, many more users than even that. These were some more of our neighbors who we saw every day. A little bit about work in China. The factories, once we drove from Shanghai to Suzhou, which was about an hour and a half away, and I would say probably 80% of the time we were passing on the road mile after mile after mile of factories that look pretty much like this. So you work in a factory or you work in a farm. This is not like your Google dining room. Well, maybe kind of, but not everyone's dressed the same. If you don't work in a factory, you're working for the man, the state authorities, like this woman, or an enormous number of entrepreneurs. This is the entrepreneur with the styrofoam business, and this is the one in Beijing who had the charcoal pieces that are still sold and still burned in houses to keep warm. Shopping is, you find all kinds of shopping in China, of course. On the very high end, in the fancy markets, there's every kind of store you want at the top end, but you notice that no one's there. There's a kind of sweetheart deal going on, at least in Shanghai, where the fancy brands, Armani and so forth, can have bragging rights, New York, Tokyo, London, Paris, Shanghai. And Shanghai has the bragging rights that they have these shops. It doesn't really matter to Armani that nobody is actually in those shops shopping, because they only pay rent as a proportion of their sales. So it's kind of a win-win for everyone. Everyone is actually really out in the markets like this, doing their daily shopping, or else, well, this is our local butcher, actually. We didn't eat a lot of meat in China, but he was the guy who was down the street from us. The Walmart, where Chinese love to shop, and it's not like, obviously, like any Walmart you've ever been in around here, if you've been in a Walmart, especially in the fish and meat departments. These are the real street markets. We traveled as far afield as we could. We went out to Gansu province, which is kind of the equivalent of Oklahoma. Hot, dry, really beautiful. And this is actually the tail end of the Great Wall that you're seeing. Farmers still tilling around the wall. We were with a friend of ours who took us up to at that point the Great Wall was about 10 feet high, and he made us scramble up on top of it. And I felt almost sacrilegious doing this, because the wall was actually just crumbling at that point, and you felt like you were, contributing to the destruction of the Great Wall. We didn't take home any remnants or anything, but it really made you feel like you were about 5 million years old to stand on that Great Wall. This is the other side of life in China. Hundreds of billions of peasants, and I say that as a respectful term, as do they. The farming looks like medieval times. So, most people are in the factories or are in the fields. These are the beautiful children in Gansu, largely Tibetan extraction. These are the lucky ones who get to go to school. And the identifying factor of this girl is that she is a first-year student in the 3-year junior high school. And you can tell she's a first-year student because you buy one uniform for the 3 years in school, and hers is large this year, fits next year, too small the 3rd year. This is I hope you can see this. I hope you can squint at least to see this. It's the dormitory room where 18 girls sleep. 9 on the top bunk, 9 on the lower bunk, squished, like sardines next to each other. You can see their locker for all of them in the background, and their thermoses lined up in a row in the foreground. This was a boarding school out in Gansu province. All the kids lived not even in villages. They just were scattered in homes around the mountains, so they'd walk several hours to school on Sunday afternoons, stay all week, and then walk home on Saturdays, and then mom would wash their uniform, which was like a tracksuit, and then they'd come back on Sunday. We traveled to Hunan province, which is kind of central, still very conservative, near where Chairman Mao was born, and is still quite revered. The antithesis to the farms in Gansu, this is a bit farther down the road in Hunan, in Changsha, city of Changsha, where Mr. Zhang, who started the Broad air conditioning factory, built his house, which is this, modeled replica of Versailles. It's where Mr. Zhang lives. This is how the other half lives in China. Being in the internet research biz, I kind of made it a personal hobby to go see as many internet cafes and bars as I could around China. That character is Wang, like net, as in tennis net, or as in internet. So it was really easy to spot the internet cafes. This was an internet cafe in Xinjiang province, which is the very, very farthest northwest, and you've heard about it recently in the news. That's where the Uyghurs live, the Muslims, so there's always a lot of unrest. This was an internet cafe near the University of Urumqi. The kids went there to do what they always do in China, which is play games, chat, go to discussion rooms, watch movies. We went to the mountain villages of Sichuan, and I heard in the village of Wolong that there was one internet cafe in town, and after following directions for about 45 minutes, found it at the back of this construction site. This was that internet cafe. Pretty basic, but populated nonetheless. I think it cost maybe 25 cents an hour, maybe 13 cents an hour, but that's how you do it in Wolong. No slideshows complete without the wedding industry, which is huge in China, just like in the US. This was in Kunming, which is a big town on the way to Yunnan out in the beautiful southwest. Typical traditional wedding. On the flip side, if you're in Shanghai and you're a 50-something-year-old parent with an unmarried 20-something-year-old child, you'll go to Renmin Guantang, People's Park, and try to do a little matchmaking for your kids. I'm going to talk about this later, but these are parents with photos and cards they made up about their children, and I'll describe it later, but keep this picture in mind. This is the matchmaking scene. So we went, we went to the Panda Reserve in Sichuan about 8 months before the earthquake, and we were lucky enough to see this absolutely fantastic panda reserve and these just incredibly darling pandas. This whole reserve was destroyed during the earthquake. They only lost one panda. They moved all of these others to another mountain on the other, across the mountains, but still in Sichuan. So all those pandas except one are doing just fine. That is China. So now we'll go back to Shanghai, where we started this trip. So when Jim and I landed in Shanghai, our first task was to just kind of set up life. We didn't have any handlers. We had no handlers. We had no fixers. We had no staff. We had no assistants. We just had us. So first we had to figure out where to live, how to get around on transport, how to buy food, how to cross the street. Any of you who've been in China know that that's one of the most terrifying experiences, just to plain cross the street. It was a rocky start. Jim drank some water unintentionally, got miserably sick for about 10 days. Since he's a journalist, we wondered if the rooms were bugged, and found out, it was kind of, no, they weren't bugged, but the authorities definitely knew we were there. They invited us out to lunch regularly. They kind of to keep track of us, to see what we were doing, and so it was a nice kind of oversight of our behavior there, and we had good lunches with them. The wind blew at 40 knots per hour for about 10 days. It was like the elephant in the room. Why didn't anybody tell us it was windy in Shanghai? It was all coming in across the Gobi Desert at that time. And for me, the biggest part of the rocky start was, as much as I had training in languages and linguistics, and as much as I tried to prepare for this experience, I found my mouth was totally paralyzed. I couldn't, and my ears were like stuffed up. I couldn't understand a single thing that I was hearing, and I couldn't say a single word, and to the point where I wondered if Meng Laoshe, my teacher, had possibly been teaching us Cantonese instead of Mandarin. But we sorted it all out. I mean, I later learned that not only does Shanghai have its own major dialect, it's a Wu language, which is as different from English as Wu is to Mandarin as German is to English. So of course I didn't understand that. The accent in Shanghai is if Meng Laoshe, my teacher, were from Beijing, it would be like he was from Boston. Suddenly I was in Shanghai as though I'd landed in Mobile, Alabama, a complete register of the phonetic shift in speaking. So it took a long time to understand just how they were pronouncing the language. But bit by bit, we got over the illness, we found our way around, I started to understand a little bit, and for me, that was the point where I became completely engaged with this language. Not only was it necessary, but I found that it was really, really fun. So I did everything I could to study as much as I possibly could. I tried kind of everything. I found a school down the street and enrolled because it had this wonderful name. It was called Miracle Mandarin. I went there to school 3 hours a day, and I watched a lot of TV. The soap operas were the best. They were a great learning tool. All the soap operas were set in a hospital. Someone was always dying. All of the family was always coming in. They had the same conversations over and over again. So I learned a lot of kind of illness language, which was good. I talked to taxi drivers. I fabricated errands I had to do. I asked for directions. I hung around little kids who talk so sweetly and purely. And so that was great. And really the reason I loved it was because our life was so overwhelming, especially at the beginning, that I felt like the process of studying the language was the one thing I could control in my life. I knew how to do this. I knew how to study languages. And at least I could control that aspect of my life in China. And interestingly, later on, among the expats that I knew in China, I found that those who had some similar kind of passion, like one was a photographer, one was interested in textiles, one was interested in modern art, those who had something they could really grab onto and feel at home with and use that as a way into the culture or being comfortable or help interpret what they were seeing on the streets were the ones who were the happiest and could kind of begin to make sense of their China experience. So for me, it happened to be the language, and that's where I went with it. I had 2 milestone victories. The first was when I went out on the street having forgotten my dictionary and thought, okay, I'm not going back for it. This is destiny. I'm going to try this today. And I don't remember my task, but I accomplished what I went out to do without my dictionary and thought, this is good. This is a sign. The second was the day I discovered that something I had learned at Miracle Mandarin actually worked on the street. So I'm going to read you real quickly what happened that day. Each morning I would trace the same path to and from my school. Just before 10 in the morning, I crossed a dozen lanes of traffic under the busy overpass of Chengdu Road and continued up Nanjing Road, past the buildings of the Shanghai TV station. Every day, just after 1 o'clock, I retraced my steps home. Day after day, week after week, my route took me past the same group of young guys who were selling knockoff goods on the sidewalk. Lady, you buy my bag. Come look my warehouse. I have Gucci, I have Prada. Each time I dutifully slowed down, engaged for a moment, and then declined the offers with strings of buyao, 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 don't want, don't want, don't want. I knew each hawker well enough to tell who had gotten a new haircut. They never seemed to recognize me. I was just another mark. Finally, one day I had enough. I snapped and dug for my new vocabulary. 昨天不要, 今天不要, 明天不要, I shouted back. Yesterday, don't want. Today, don't want. Tomorrow, don't want. They stopped cold, stunned. Then one irrepressible soul quickly recovered and with a plaintive look whispered earnestly, 后天, meaning day after tomorrow. Yeah. So as I improved a little bit, I started noticing things about the language caught my attention. Maybe it was a noun or a phrase or a little piece of the grammar. And so I would try to, at first, follow the linguistic trail of what was that caught my attention. And then along the way of explaining it, I realized that I was not only learning about the language, but I was learning also about modern life in China. And these did become my windows into understanding things, larger truths of China, like romance or protocol or relationships or behavior or something about the dreams of the Chinese people. So I want to give you a couple examples of those things right now. And I think you have to start with tones, because tones is absolutely the nemesis of every Westerner's first trial with learning Chinese. Why do we find them so hard to hear, so hard to say, and so hard to remember? And I mean, why would a language even have tones in the first place? And why was it that none of the Chinese could ever understand my tones when I thought I was saying something perfectly right? So first of all, there's a really curious kind of linguistic background to tones in the language. It starts with the sound system of Chinese. The syllable structure is very short. It's just consonant vowel, bu, ta, shi, ma, hui. That's about it. And there are only 400 of these syllables, as opposed to English, which has 4,000. Really complicated syllables, a vowel and a whole bunch of consonants on each side. Words like stretched, where you've got all those consonants clustered together, or plumped. So we have a few homonyms in our language, like the word bear, bear as in the animal, or to carry, or naked bear. Chinese, as you can imagine, with 400 syllables and a word being either one or two syllables put together, is replete with homonyms. They're just homonyms all over the place. And the tones are actually a really clever way of capitalizing on those few syllables and making it a whole lot more. So if you've got a syllable like ma, and you've got ma, ma, and you've got 4 tones, every time you put a different tone on it, you get a different meaning. You get a different word. Ma with a high tone means mom, mother. Ma, falling rising tone means horse. Ma means swear. So you've got, for starters, 1,600. Actually, there are 4 tones plus a kind of bonus no tone at all. So 5 times at least those 400 syllables. You're still left with a whole lot of homonyms, but at least it's a really good start. So it's hard for us because these tones, we're not used to hearing tones. We're not used to reproducing tones, and yet when you think about it, English does have some sense of tones in our language. But it works differently. If you say in a sentence, you take in your hat and use the rising tone on the hat, you know that you've got a question, as opposed to you're taking your hat, not a question. But in English, it changes the whole semantics of the sentence rather than the semantics of the word in Chinese. So what you're left with in Chinese is just this whole bunch of arbitrary learning. There's not a single rule to follow, like raise the tone on the last word. It's just, you've just got to memorize all this stuff. So of course it's hard. There's no reason behind it. And it's just rote memorization of something you can't really hear very well to start with. And it's arbitrary. I'll skip that part. So it's frustrating. It's really frustrating when you feel like you're working hard with these tones and you are constantly misunderstood. And every Westerner, I promise you, has a tone story of how you've made a complete fool of yourself with tones. And so I will read you mine. After several months in China, I developed a bad craving for cheese, which is a precious and hard-to-find luxury in this highly lactose-intolerant nation. Desperate, I stopped in a Taco Bell at the fringe of swanky downtown Shanghai, fixed on the idea of a gooey, sloppy, cheesy burrito. A tall Chinese youth, proudly wearing a black sombrero and a sequined velvet vest, greeted me at the entrance. He barked a hearty "Huan Guanling," which means welcome, come on in. Still quite new to China, I had rehearsed my lines to ask for the menu and inquire about takeout. My teacher told me this. 有打包吗? Do you have takeout? When the greeter in the sombrero looked puzzled, I asked again, pointing to the menu, pointing to the door, miming the act of carrying a bag out the door. Still no response. So I cut out the grammar and simply said, 打包, takeout? Nothing. Then I tried all sorts of tones on the 2 syllables of 打包. High tones, rising tones, falling, rising tones, and various combinations of tones. All the time I'm thinking, come on, guy, how hard can this be? Work with me here. He called for reinforcements from the kitchen. Several more young boys in sombreros emerged, listening intently as I repeated 打包 over and over again. Finally, one erupted in triumph. Ah, 打包! This uttered with a very emphatic high tone on the bao. The greeter solemnly answered, yo, we have it. And then they, at my expense, laughed and all went back into the kitchen. Yeah. So I later found out, went back to my dictionary. There's so many meanings for the word bao, da bao. And I'm sure one of them is like, can you give me a big hug? So why is it so hard for them to understand us? Partly, this takes a leap of faith that the sounds, it's not just the sounds, but it's the sounds and the tone together. And if this is how your language works, it's impossible to separate those two from each other. It's like if you're colorblind and I say, okay, A and B, distinguish these for me. It's just not really able to do that, especially if you have had little exposure to foreigners, for the Chinese. One young Chinese woman told me a really interesting story. She said the way her English teachers taught her English was that each word had a falling tone, like book, chair, clock. And when she learned the rule for how you say a question to raise the tone on the final word in the sentence, she just couldn't do it. She said, I know I'm supposed to say, should I take my hat? But she just was, should I take my hat? She couldn't make herself change that tone because, like in Chinese, it was part of how she learned the word. So the lesson to me in all this is just what an impasse there is between the two systems of these language, that for us it's so much arbitrary learning, and for the Chinese it's just impossible to disentangle those two elements. Another thing that I noticed in Chinese was, as I started to learn a little more, I found I was feeling very abrupt and even rude when I was speaking in Chinese. If you go into a restaurant and the server says, would you like some water? 不要. It's like that 不要 on the street with the hawkers. Don't want. There's none of this, oh no thanks, I don't think I'd like any now, maybe I'll have some later, thank you very much, thanks a lot, no. It's just no softeners, 不要. In fact, I realized in China that after a year and a half, I did not know how to say please, which was a really surprising thing, because obviously it's what you usually learn, one of the first things in the language, and it just wasn't that much, and none of my teachers had ever taught me how to say please, and I just went around saying thank you for everything, but instead of please, at any rate. So the odd thing about this feeling rude was that I noticed I would often see behavior that seemed very polite, and yet I was hearing language that to me sounded abrupt and rude. If we were at a restaurant and saw a group of people together at a table, obviously good friends and so forth, you'd see this nice behavior, like the host would pour everyone's beer before pouring his own, every time. Maybe the woman at the table would very nicely use her chopsticks to choose the finest morsel of chicken for everyone else before serving herself. So very polite behavior. And then in the midst of it, someone would kind of blurt out, 给我盐, which is the equivalent of, give me the salt. And you want to say, please give me the salt, or please may I have the salt. But I knew that it was the proper way to ask for that salt, but it's, those softeners in the language just didn't happen. So I went back to my linguistic monographs, seriously, trying to find the answer to this question. And I asked all my friends, why this disconnect? Why am I getting this feeling of abruptness? So my Chinese friends say they notice that Westerners use lots of pleases and thank yous, 请, 谢谢, when speaking Chinese. And actually, they say we use way too many of these for Chinese taste. A Chinese linguist, Kai Dujan, says that using a please, as in please pass the salt, actually has the opposite effect of politeness here in China. The Chinese way of being polite to each other with words is to shorten the social distance between you, and saying please serves to insert a kind of buffer or space that says, in effect, we need to have some formality here between us. One of my tutors was this great young guy named Danny. He was, on the one hand, he was a real Chinese nationalist. On the other hand, he was really edgy and global, and he had a faux hawk, and I really liked him. But so I asked him about this interpretation, and he said, yes, good friends are so close, they're like part of you. Would you say please or thank you to yourself? It just doesn't make sense. So it was a real lesson to me about the complexity of both how we construct our kind of cultural and linguistic sense of politeness, and how it was just not matched with what I was seeing in China. And actually, for this Google audience, I've been thinking, I don't know how this works in translation, but what would you do if you were going one direction or another? Do you put those pleases in? Do you take those pleases out? And what does it do to the kind of translation? And how do you figure out when you're supposed to put them in or out if you have a machine translation? Or how do you even do that with you can't really do that with context, I don't think, unless you see a video of what's going on. At any rate, I guess I leave that one to you, but maybe it's something to, I'm sure there's got to be an answer to how to think about that. So one more example, and this is about the word love, which is ai, A-I, falling tone I in Chinese. I first noticed something odd about this word about 25 years ago when we first went to China in the late 80s. We had our two then little blonde boys with us, one of whom actually is now a big blonde boy and works in your commerce group here at Google, but he's not here today. And we were going around China with these little guys, and this one Chinese woman looked at me and looked at the our two sons, and she said, "Which one do you love more?" And I was, of course, completely taken aback and said, "I love them both the same. I mean, what would you say?" And she said, "Well, but really, which one do you love more?" And so this went back and forth a bit, and the conversation went nowhere, but it stuck with me, for 25 years. How could she have asked me this question, and what is it with this word? It must be something about love. So fast forward to 4 years ago when we went to China, and during our 3 years there, we did meet a lot of Chinese Western couples, and eventually we'd hear this same conversation over and over again. The Western half of the couple would say, "My wife, my husband, she'll never say I love you. She just can't say I love you, whether it's in Mandarin or in English. She just won't say I love you." Similarly, the Chinese half of the couple would say, "Oh, my husband, he's always saying, I love you, I love you, I love you." It just is so hollow, it's so gratuitous, and it means nothing. So these conversations were kind of going at odds, again, around this funny word of love. So then in Beijing, we were moving to Beijing, and I spent a few days with a young Chinese woman in her 30s. She had a little kid, she had a job, she had a husband, she had 4 grandparents taking care of the little kid. And we were talking about our families and relationships. She knew I was a lot older than she was, and she said to me, "So you've been married a long time?" I said, "Yes, yes." She said, "You must love your husband a lot." And I said, "Yes," and how odd, funny question, and said to her, I'm sure you must love your husband a lot too." And she said, "I love him for now." And I thought, no, she can't. No, I hardly know this woman. She's telling me this. What does this mean? Why is she saying this? And my first reaction was, maybe it's something funny with the language, because in Chinese, it's such it's an uninflected language. There are no tenses, there are no declensions, there are no conjugation, there's no agreement, there's no gender. It's very simple. So if you use the word love, it's just like you're stuck with the infinitive all the time. And so I thought, okay, maybe she's meaning this in some, I gave her the benefit of the doubt, some existential way, like I am in love with him, or I am loving him, or whatever. I didn't really come to a conclusion about that, but kind of think that maybe some of it is that she was trying to build, usually since there are no tense in Chinese, you have to build context around what you're saying, like yesterday or tomorrow or whatever, to put some time frame around it. So I thought perhaps she was just having some trouble with the for now and meaning forever or whatever. But then reading a bit about the history of love and marriage, back in dynastic times, when Confucianism was very strong, the idea of love and marriage was very arranged. It was formal. It was harmonious. It was a lot of obedience. Moving up to the Mao era, it was much more about marriage for political reasons. This is a good, strong marriage for the state, maybe more egalitarian. And now it's interestingly kind of flipping back to a little bit of Confucianism about matchmaking, like you saw in that slide, with young romantic love of the people who are in their 20s, having a very different sensibility of how romance and love and marriage should work. And it is striking that you see this kind of organic change going on. And here is something that I saw. This one day, it was about the spring of 2009 in Beijing. The Cherry Blossom Spring Flower Festival this year happened to coincide with the first gloriously warm and clear weekend days of the season. All of Beijing was out of doors after the dank and dreary winter. On Sunday at Yuyuantan Park on the west side of the city, the boys bought their girls sprigs of bright pink and white plastic cherry blossoms, which the girls wound into wreaths and wore in their hair. The lake was crowded with pedal boats, and farmers sold baby chicks and bunnies from cardboard boxes. Everyone was paired off, or so it seemed. Young couples filled the subways and the parks that day, all locked in embrace. They held hands, they hugged, they kissed, they spooned, all mindless or careless of their public display. I would say those are the youth of today's Marry for Love generation. On that same day, had we been in Shanghai's People's Park instead, like on that slide, we would have no doubt again seen the serious matchmaking meetings that we observed there every weekend we lived in Shanghai. Parents in their 50s, worried about their unmarried offspring in their 20s, would gather in the northwest corner of the park with their homemade signs describing their children. This son was born in the year of the monkey, 1.8 meters tall, had a job in a small private company, was type A blood. That daughter was a graduate of East Normal University, 1.6 meters tall, type A blood, Han ethnic extraction. The parents would circle around tentatively, reading each other's posters, huddling with their spouses, and perhaps sidling up toward another couple to strike up a conversation and to see where things might go from there. The grown children were never in evidence, and who knows, they may have been locked in embrace on the number 2 subway line at that very moment. They were adults of another era when trying to arrange marriages for their very modern youth. So, this to me became a kind of metaphor for a lot of what we were seeing in China, that it was the sensibilities of a different era of love meeting up with this new era of love, and so many things in China seemed in flux and with attention in the same kind of way. So that is pretty much my story. It's how language as survival came for me to be my way into understanding and seeing more of the culture and explain some of these puzzles of everyday life, and especially things like politeness or love or romance. So, thank you. Do you want me to, if there are any questions, or what should we do? Okay.
If anyone has questions, there's a microphone to your left.
Before the microphone gets really flooded, are there any tips on even hearing the tones? I know you spoke of difficulty in saying them. For a person like me, I can't even hear them. I had an office mate tell me he demonstrated the 4 tones, and I said, that sounds nice in practice, but how do you say them when it's really quick? Because he went slowly over it. He said bow, and I kind of got that. And then he said it really fast, and I couldn't tell anything anymore,
Right.
And I just think it's a scam. I don't think there are any tones.
Yeah. Okay, a couple of things here. One is, the last point I think is really interesting because I actually kind of agree with you. What I think it comes down to is that you really do have to pay attention to the critical words in your message, like da bao. I was talking about takeout, so that word definitely mattered. And all the others you can kind of fudge over a little bit. But if you've got that kernel, then you're home free. The trouble, of course, is that kernel. And so I would ask people, what's your system? How can you remember this stuff? I had one teacher named Sandy at Miracle Mandarin, actually. Her system was, she was a really enthusiastic teacher. It was to be very aerobic. So our lessons would be like, da bao, would be just up and down and rising and falling all day long on our feet. This was a 3-hour class. We had a break in the middle, and I'm telling you, by the end of 90 minutes of this up and down with the tones, you're just exhausted. And it never worked. Another group had what they called, my artsy friend said, it's all about colors. What you imagine, here's your system. You have a tone, you assign a color to the tone. So I thought, okay, I will try that. Blue will be falling, rising, like the ocean. Yellow, high tone, like the sun. Something very intuitive. Every time you learn a new word, you visualize that word in that color, and then you're home free. For them, it worked. For me, this was a problem. It was just another layer of something I was supposed to remember. I couldn't, okay, what color was that word? I could not do it. I think the most effective thing is not what you want to hear, which is that it's just constant exposure and constant repetition over and over and over again. The one teacher I had, if he said a word, if he was teaching us a word in class, he would not say it once, he would say it like 130 times in that day. So that you just kind of got into the rhythm of it, and finally it just sounded right, or it didn't sound right if it wasn't right. It's like le and la in French, you just kind of get there. And I think there's no magic, except you're right, it's kind of a scam. Yeah.
Given the differences and relative incomprehensibility between the different Chinese dialects, I'm curious as to whether the tone structure, the usage of tones and so forth, varies a lot across the dialects or not.
Absolutely, and a great question. And my favorite part of this answer is that I've heard from a number of people that when Mao was ruling the country, many of the Chinese people could not understand him because he spoke with such a heavy Hunan accent, and sometimes the tones varied. For example, in Sichuan, I've heard that, let's see, I think it's a reversal of the 2nd and 4th tones, just kind of across the board. So, and not only that, but you get so yes, the answer is yes, there are dialect differences in tones for a single word. And furthermore, the tone of a word can change depending on the word that came before it. So if you've got, let's see, how's this work? If you've got, I think it's 2 sounds together, falling, rising, then the first one is actually only rising. So that tone changes too. So not only, another arbitrary thing to remember or not. The great unifying factor, and I think one of the strong reasons to hang on to is characters, and one of the strong reasons to hang on to it, the character writing system. no matter what the accent, what the dialect, and even from, you know, Cantonese to Mandarin to largely Japanese, it's the same characters. So every TV program you watch will be subtitled in characters so that across the country, speakers of any of the dialects with any of the accents can read the same thing and understand the message. So, you know, it's not only a problem for us, it's a problem for the Chinese too. Yeah. Have I exhausted you? I have one other thing I can talk about actually.
So you were talking about the use of please and thank you.
Yeah.
And I was just curious in your description of like why it wouldn't be so appropriate in a formal situation. Like, well, then when is it appropriate to use please? What is that word even good for if it's not in this kind of formal situation?
It is good in the formal situation. It does insert formality. So if you're in meetings, if you're you know, having a meeting, or if you're with people you don't know very well and you want to really behave yourself with good manners, then you use the pleases and thank yous. It's when you're with your buddies that you generally don't do it. But the you know, that is part of it, and what it's part of is this absence of softening things. Like in English, where we have the woulds and coulds and shoulds and mights that kind of make everything a little bit nicer. There aren't those in Chinese. It's very simple in many ways, a very minimalist kind of way of speaking, and you just get the message out there. And of course, this is not a hard and fast rule. Like I was thinking, we have our own family skirmishes at home where I would say to my husband, Jim, would you like to take out the trash? And he always gets really mad at me when I say, would you like to take out the... Of course I wouldn't like to take out the trash. If you want me to take out the trash, ask me to take out the trash. Would you take out the trash? But I feel rude if I'm saying, would you take out the trash? Like I'm ordering him around. So I try to make it softer. So, you know, I think we all have those ways of doing things with the language, but it seems much more stark to me in Chinese.
Over the 3 years that you were in the country and as you traveled around, did your friends from the government continue to take you out to lunch?
It depended where we traveled around. It was an interesting situation because Jim was not in China on an official journalist visa. If you're there as an official journalist, you have to register with the authorities every time you go to a new city to interview people. And that is just a rule. He couldn't get a journalist visa because it's extremely elaborate, and your company has to, your media outlet has to establish itself there with a presence and so forth. And so that wasn't the way we did it, because we were actually visiting professors and teachers at schools where our friends taught. So we were free to travel around the country at will. And nobody, we were not officially under anyone's jurisdiction to do that, which is made for a whole lot of convenience, as you can imagine. On the other hand, we never got to Tibet because every time we tried, there were uprisings of one sort or another, or it was a tense political time, and there were so many papers that you had to fill out to get to Tibet. We knew that that would not happen because our agreement on how we were there was kind of a known but understood but slightly wiggly agreement. So there were lines, there were borders we did not cross. And like many things with the rules and regulations in China, we realized we were guests of the country. We realized that could end with 2 days' notice at any time. And and we realized people knew we were there. So like with many things, it gives you a little bit of discomfort to just know that somebody's always aware of what you're doing. But if you're a good guest in the country, then it will be okay. So it was a very interesting kind of level of tension constantly. Yeah. If you want to stay, I will just tell you one other really funny thing about the language that kind of drove me crazy. Just flip through to the very end of this. This is about two little words in Chinese, xia and shang. Xia, these both have falling tones. I couldn't make the tones on those words, but xia, they're very commonly used. And my teacher first introduced them that in, ooh, did I do that? Oh no. You know what this is? I think it's going to auto-advance itself. Anyway, xia was first introduced as place. Xia means in the future, and no, where are we? Time and place. Wait a second here. Okay, first introduced as place on the right. That's funny. This is only like showing half my slide. This one, it means underneath, like underneath the table. And shang means on top of, like on top of the table, or Shanghai, above the sea. So fine, you've got this sense of place. And that all makes a lot of sense. But on that same day, the teacher introduced that xia and shang also have another meaning, which is a reference to time, that xia means in the future. Not only does it mean underneath, as in place, but it means ahead or in the future, as in time. Shang means not only above or on top of, but it means in the past. And I think you have to kind of trust me here that while this makes tremendous logical, you can get these two logic systems all right, trying to put them in your head at the same time and remember which one goes with which doesn't seem to make any sense. Like, why should shang mean below and ahead, and why should shang mean above and behind in time? So I found I had to make a solution for myself, a kind of visual or mnemonic device, where AB was my time axis and CD was my place axis. And so I would put xia in the southeast quadrant and shang in the northwest quadrant, and then I could kind of remember where each of these went, at least long enough for many months until I got to the point where it was intuitive. And this kind of mixing of the references of your whole system of time and place, I found both just completely difficult to penetrate and absorb. And our teachers hadn't a clue, that couldn't understand why this was so hard for us as Westerners, which I thought was a really interesting facet of Chinese. So there you go. Just another case of where you think many things are given. They are not at all given. They're just peculiar to your own language. So you can go back to work. Thank you.